Welcome, everyone. Very excited to see you all today. We want to welcome you to our third webinar in our pandemic series. I am Jodi Detjen. I am Professor of Management and the Program Director for the MBA program at Suffolk University. You know, today's discussion comes at a very difficult and reflective time for our country and ourselves. Businesses have an opportunity to be leaders, actually, as we try to seek to figure out how to make change in our organizations so organizations can be more inclusive and open. Thank you for joining this important discussion today. So logistically, we're going to have a panel for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions for about 15 minutes. We appreciate those that have asked questions ahead of time as well, and we'll be weaving those in throughout. So I would like to turn it over right now to Joyya Smith, who is the head of our inclusion and diversity effort here at Suffolk University. And Joyya is going to talk about the importance of today's date. Joyya.
Good afternoon, everyone. If I may, I would like to share a little bit about Juneteenth. So listen in. Juneteenth is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States. From its Galveston, Texas origin in 1865, the observance of June 19th as the African American Emancipation Day has spread across the United States and beyond. Today, Juneteenth commemorates African American freedom and emphasizes education and achievement. It is a day, a week, and in some areas, a month marked with celebrations, guest speakers, picnics, and family gatherings. It is a time for reflection and rejoicing. It's a time for assessment, self-improvement, and for planning for the future. I invite you all to take time today to do those things. First, reflection. Reflect over slavery and its impact, lasting impacts today. I also encourage you to speak with others about what you've learned. Take time to also respond in different ways. Racism still exists in certain forms, and I encourage you to help us dismantle it and make sure that we're able to make improvements for all of us. So thank you, and I pass it over to Tammy.
Thank you, Joyya. And Jodi, thank you for the introduction. My name is Tammy MacLean, and I am a professor of management at Suffolk University. I'm also the director for the Center of Executive Education, and I do both research and teaching in the areas of diversity and inclusion, amongst other things. And today I'm going to start by just briefly introducing the people on our panel, and then we will have them tell you a little bit more about themselves and their backgrounds before we move into our conversation. We have with us today Ana Ribeiro, Senior Diversity and Inclusion Analyst from Wellington Management. We have Paul Francisco, Chief Diversity Officer and Head of Workplace Development Programs from State Street Corporation. We have Jennifer Rineer, Deputy Chair of Diversity and Inclusion from RTI International. And you just met our own Joyya Smith, the VP of Diversity, Access, and Inclusion at Suffolk University. I'd like to ask you all just to say a couple of minutes about your professional background and the work that you do in this area before we start with questions. And let's start with Ana.
Thank you, Tammy, and happy Juneteenth, everyone. I'm definitely grateful to be on this panel with all the prestigious panelists on here as well. So my name, Ana Ribeiro. I am a first-generation Cape Verdean American and a mom of a vivacious 9-year-old daughter. Her name is Kaylani. My title, as you know, is Senior D&I Analyst at Wellington Management, and my role pretty much consists of being a D&I thought partner to our business line leaders, our talent acquisition team, and our 10 business networks of Americas, in addition to managing several external diversity associations that many of you might be familiar with, like the Partnership, Alpha. But yes, in a nutshell, that is what I do at Wellington Management.
Thank you, Ana.
Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Paul Francisco, Chief Diversity Officer, State Street Corporation. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I've been in diversity management and diversity recruiting for over 20 years. I lead our global strategy around not only inclusion, diversity, equity, but also workforce development programs. And happy to be here with you this afternoon and looking forward to this most appropriate discussion, and happy Juneteenth indeed to everyone.
Thank you, Paul. Jen?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jen. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. My background is in industrial and organizational psychology, so I do research and applied work on improving employee and organizational performance and well-being. I work at RTI International, which is a large nonprofit research organization that has a mission to improve the human condition. And I kind of wear two hats in the organization. So I am a leader on RTI's Diversity and Inclusion Council, and I'm also a research psychologist and program manager in our Center for Policing Research and Investigative Science. So two roles that are very relevant right now. And so I'm happy to be joining this panel and talking to you all about how we can move these areas forward.
Thank you, Jen. And Joyya?
Good afternoon again. I'm Joyya Smith, Vice President for Diversity, Access, and Inclusion at Suffolk University. My role is to incorporate diversity and inclusion in every fabric of our institution by trying our best to incorporate diversity and inclusion in all of our operational activities. So that's anywhere from our recruitment, our hiring, to our curriculum, to working with faculty and staff, and most importantly, helping to engage our students. I do that in a number of ways. I work with our employee resource groups, I work with human resources, and I work on a number of other initiatives to help move these efforts forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Joyya. So as you know, our conversation today is centered on the notion of what is the role and the obligation of business, in this very unique moment that we are in. And I'd like to start by hearing about how your organizations have responded to the killing of George Floyd, the accusations of Amy Cooper, other recent instances of violence against people of color, the ensuing protests, and this kind of moment in time, this reawakening or new openness to this conversation about racial injustice and racism in the United States and globally. I'm interested in what your organizations have done, if anything, and why what they did seems important. And I think, we can probably start with Ana and then move around as people want to participate. You can speak up.
Thanks, Tammy. So at Wellington, we actually received an abundance of emails, and that's from our 3 managing partners, from business line leaders, and those are CEO directs, senior leaders, line managers, all sending their sympathies to our African-American employees, specifically targeting our Shades Business Network members, and some reached out individually to their colleagues, expressing their sorrows and concerns about our well-being. In response to these emails, our Black colleagues had a chance to expressively share their stories and allow their vulnerability to show through their words, and in the end really helped our white colleagues understand their experiences. Because sharing what we go through makes it real to other people, and now our colleagues are more conscious about what we go through. From this, there was an overwhelming ask from our white colleagues about how can I help? And our Shades members, with the guidance of our Managing Director of Global Diversity and Inclusion, which is Shauna Ferguson, she compiled a list of what can I do? She called it What Can I Do list, and sent it to all employees. And the first on the list was empathize, right? So we want all of our employees to empathize, acknowledge and respect differences, because no two people's experiences are exactly the same. Consider the disproportionate emotional strain that events are having on our members of the Black heritage community. So definitely empathize in that portion. Second thing was to learn, whether they are parents, consumers, board members, manager of colleagues, and regardless of your tenure or position at the firm, they are in a position to make a difference. So we want them to take the time to consider their roles and see how they can help make an impact. And that could first start with just educating, right? Just educating themselves on Black and African-American cultures, whether that's attending a Shades Network event, which is one of our business networks, or reflect on lessons learned in reading literature about social injustice. The third thing was more of acting, right? Passion is nothing more than a fleeting emotion if we don't act with intention. We can do all things like having, courageous conversations with another, being color brave, hire more underrepresented talent, and even develop our talent. And lastly, even donate time and funding to organizations that support the African American community. And lastly, that question around why did we choose this approach, right? I truly feel that this approach was chosen because our leaders care about our employees and they realize that silence is just endorsing the cause. So they decided to be vocal about it and support and just being a true ally.
Thank you, Anna.
You're welcome.
Jen, what's happening at RTI International along these lines?
So we saw some similarities. So we had, initial messages coming out from leadership and then an opportunity for, Black colleagues and others to kind of respond. I think one of the things that I really appreciated about what RTI has done is just being honest kind of about where we've been in this journey and where we're hoping to go. And so, there have been conversations about this in all of the meetings that we've had across the Institute, in different divisions and management meetings, et cetera. And I think what's really been appreciated is just kind of not trying to pretend it's something it's not, like acknowledging in many cases, we should have been putting more resources into diversity and inclusion, into, research that's specifically focusing on these issues before, like just putting that out there. But here's where we are now. Let's have an open conversation and see where we can move forward. I think one of the things that's also been really appreciated is, in the beginning of all of this happening, I think a lot of requests were being made of Black employees and other employees of color because white employees wanted to say, well, please, you tell us, what would be helpful to you? Like, can you attend this conversation? Can you facilitate this, discussion? Can you provide resources? And it was putting a lot of burden on people who were already overburdened. And so I think our managers and, the leaders of our Black Employee Resource Group and other leaders across the Institute have helped people understand, like, it's not the sole job of Black colleagues and colleagues of color to educate the rest of us on this. We need to take it upon ourselves to take action, and just trying to kind of fumble through this process of figuring out for white colleagues, especially those who haven't thought about these issues so much, what is the role that we play? Because it really is, it's our issue to address as well. So I think just having some of these really difficult conversations has been really critical. And just one other thing I'll mention before I pause for now is just that we've increased the offerings that we kind of already had standing. We have internal trainings on allyship, fostering inclusive interactions, inclusive leadership. So there are kind of these things that we've been doing all along, but didn't get as much visibility as, as others have mentioned. And so now there's a lot of demand. There's more resources available because people realize how important it is. So I think it's a combination of providing resources to employees who want and need to learn, and just having these honest conversations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've heard a lot of back and forth about the obligation of white people to do their own research and not put that on people of color necessarily. It made me wonder if Joyya of Suffolk University should buy everybody a copy of White Fragility and distribute them as a way of moving that process forward. Paul, what's going on at State Street? Did State Street respond in some specific way?
Yeah, actively responding. A lot of the same things that Jen and Anna have highlighted, we've done. Our CEO sent out a letter to all employees 3 weeks ago when things first started to evolve. All of our management committee members did the same thing. They're all having town halls with their folks. Me and our CEO, Ronald Hanley, had a town hall now it seems like 2 weeks ago, attended by, close to 6,000 people live stream. And we had a really frank conversation about what's happening. The one thing that we talked a lot about is the emotional toll that this is taken on Black employees. And to Jen's point, that's having some really interesting sort of repercussions and or things that are coming out in the Black community that perhaps hadn't come out within State Street, perhaps that hadn't come out before. And so that's allowing us to have some really frank and honest discussions, conversations, forums, and all kinds of different ways. But the approach that we've taken in terms of action, so there are things that obviously we amplify that we already were doing, right? So whether it's supporting certain educational, economic access, social justice type of issues, obviously we're looking at that strategy from our foundation perspective. We look at all our talent processes and, just kind of reiterating all the things that we have in place in terms of, diverse slates requirements, diverse interview panels, the diversity goals that we established, et cetera, and saying, are we optimizing all of the things that we've been doing, right? Our on-campus recruiting strategy and our HBCU relationships, et cetera. And, to Jane's point, our inclusive leadership, trainings and conscious bias training has been a staple of our sort of suite of development products and learning products for a long time. And this is an opportunity to sort of remind people that those trainings are there, et cetera. Obviously we're focusing more now on racial, specific to racial and social justice issues. The one thing that this has generated, obviously, has been a very direct conversation on racism, but more importantly on the verb, which is, how do you become an anti-racist, right? Yeah, it's great, and how do you be an ally? But being an ally means being proactive. It's not a reactive thing. And so how do we make sure that our white colleagues feel empowered to and engage enough to do this and to take ownership of it. And the last thing I'll say is that there is, from a State Street perspective, there is this sort of expectation that we will have some sort of, stewardship, board governance type of response similar to what we did with Fearless Girl, to say, what can we do from an advocacy perspective, from legislation perspective, to move policy change, to move practice change, to look internally, at how we are represented and whether we have enough representation of Black and African American talent at the top of our organization, from our board to our executive committee, et cetera. So those are all things that are happening. And looking at our investments in our community, investment in our supply diversity pipeline, investments directly into social justice and racial equity type of organizations, in addition to what we've already been doing with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, with King Boston, and other efforts, the Equal Justice Project, et cetera. So that's what's happening.
That's a lot. Paul, can I ask you just to talk a little bit more, and maybe other people want to chime in on this question. So you said, we need to help white people figure out how to become allies. Ana said, we have a list of, what can I do list. What can we do to help white people feel more comfortable engaging? Because I feel like there's fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of putting one's foot in one's mouth, that gets in the way of this for a lot of people.
So I'm going to have a somewhat controversial answer to that. It's not my job to make white people feel comfortable engaging, right? So what I like to say is, this is the time where, people need to reflect on their own and figure out what they need to do. And to Ana's and to Jen's points earlier, you can't put the burden on us to tell you how to engage. It's just, we have enough that we're dealing with, emotionally on a daily basis. So I don't want to have the extra burden to have to tell folks. I want them to do that themselves. And I think that they're very much capable of doing so. And yes, there is a apprehension into, well, I don't want to offend anybody. Do I say the wrong thing? Do I do the wrong thing? I actually think that I make mistakes, right? Yesterday, I sent out a note to the whole organization, and some people didn't necessarily agree with the tone of the note. And I picked up the phone, I called a couple of people to get their perspective, and I was like, you know what, you're absolutely right. That's my fault. I should have probably been more thoughtful about it. But those conversations allow you to learn, allow you to move forward. And so, we need to stop being afraid of making a mistake or offending anyone, because then things will continue to be the way they are. People will sit back, be passive about this, and not be active. And actively engage.
So is that the answer from you, that answer, you know, I think that it's not my job to help you feel comfortable. Is there a different answer from State Street? If State Street wants people to be able to be an ally, is there a different answer from an organizational perspective, or no?
Kind of, yes, but I mean, we give people resources, right? We similar to Wellington, we provided a list with an the organization with an exhaustive list of things that they can think about and do, but we're not mandating anything. We're just saying, hey, here's what you should, you know, take advantage of. So there's a list of resources out there. There are tons of things that we already put out there in terms of content that people should look into. You know, content about Juneteenth and the historical meaning of Juneteenth, content around if I'm a white person, how do I become an active ally, etc. So those things already, you know, from a institutional perspective. Now, it doesn't mean that if somebody gives me a call and says, Paul, trust me, I've been fielding calls left and right from executives, from folks that want to help, from people that want to understand. And I'm not saying I'm not having those conversations with them. What I'm saying is I don't sit there and expect me to tell you what to do, right? It's if you want to have a conversation and if you want to sort of engage in a discussion around, hey, here's what I'm thinking, what do you think? That's different, right? Then, Paul, I don't know what to do. Please tell me what to do. That's, you know, that's when I say, well, why don't you figure it out and then come back to me and then we can have a further conversation about it.
Gotcha.
Just to add to Paul's point as well, it's more it's okay to be uncomfortable, right? It's like you don't have to be right about these situations. You can ask the wrong questions. That happens, right? Just like Paul's example on sending an email. It happens. Own up to it and say, how can I fix this? How can I make this right? And I feel like as long as there's that genuinity behind it, that people are okay with it. If you make a mistake, let's work together on helping. How can we get it better? And similar to Paul's point in terms of the different trainings, same thing here. We put that forward. We offer unconscious bias, managing inclusion. We also encourage that whole reverse mentoring, you know, peer up with a Shade's colleague, a Black African-American colleague, and have that conversation, that open, honest dialogue where you can feel comfortable asking those uncomfortable conversations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Joyya, is the university doing anything either in direct response, and I'm asking this knowing some of the answer, of course, because I'm getting your emails, but in terms of a direct response to the environment that we're in and to help people learn more, what are the things that we're offering to our business students, really, who are the future of this?
So first and foremost, I would say we responded quickly with statements, but in our statements, we also mentioned that a statement is not enough. And so one of the things we want to encourage is that independent learning, but then also that interpersonal conversation. And I think, you know, when it comes to discomfort, we learn outside of our comfort zone. So we have to live in that discomfort and we have to engage in it in order to disrupt and dismantle these systems that are not working for us as a whole. So as an institution, we are encouraging people to do that, but we're also encouraging conversation. So we've had 4 or 5 different forums, virtual forums, where faculty, staff, and students were able to express their feelings behind what's happening and even solutions on how we can do things better in the future. The students and the Black Student Union and Caribbean Student Network, they put on a wonderful presentation about police brutality and just their thoughts around racism and how we can make things better. When I tell you that was probably the most notable session that we've had in the last 3 weeks, because it allowed faculty, staff, and students to really engage in what's happening and to really come into agreement that something has to be done to make it better. So that's just one of many things that we've done. In fact, one of our, I guess, better activities will be a reading circle that we will read Just Mercy as a university and have some discussions around it. Not sure if you're familiar with Brian Stevenson, but he is the author of the book. And there's also a movie starring Jamie Foxx. We're wanting our faculty, staff, and students and alumni to come together, read this material, and have these difficult conversations, because that's the only way we're able to grow. and learn, explore, change, disrupt, all of those things. So we're doing that and some other things. As the others mentioned, we have ongoing trainings and workshops, we have events, and now I think people are a little bit more welcoming to attending those. So we're welcoming people into the fold. We want this awakening to not be lost. We want people to engage and to be a part. And so we're always open to suggestions on how to do things better and to do more, but we have to be intentional in order for this to really be transformed in an appropriate way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Joyya. You know, it's interesting, and I'm asking myself recently, and I'm curious as to how you've been thinking about this. You know, is what's going on now, does it require a different response than the things that organizations have been doing around D&I, around diversity and inclusion? You know, you know, and this is part of this, you know, what is the obligation of business at this moment in time? And what does it look like? And how does it differ for you compared to what we've been doing for what feels like now forever, dealing with these issues? But it does feel like we're in a qualitatively different moment. Do you see it requiring a different response from your organizations or from business in general? Anyone?
I think a big shift that's been happening at RTI, and we were kind of already on this trajectory, but something that just needs to happen sooner is, you know, I think diversity and inclusion was viewed kind of as like its own separate little thing. So here are the people who are on the council. Here are the people who, you know, oversee the employee resource groups. Here are the members, et cetera. And, you know, all the events and trainings and things that those groups, you know, developed and put forth were open to all staff. But of course, then you only get the people who are already aware of these things. You kind of, you know, you're not really reaching the people you really need to reach, who are the people who aren't thinking about this stuff and who are, you know, by not acting intentionally inclusive, are acting exclusively. And so what we are doing more now is just ingraining diversity and inclusion into all the practices that already exist. So like one example is, you know, we have these sort of guiding behaviors and principles that we use that folks are supposed to incorporate into their personal and development goals, and those are used in their annual performance assessments. And the newest one that we just added is called Engage Inclusively. So there's only like 7 behaviors overall. There aren't that many of them, but it's like what we really care about at RTI as a core value. And this is something that we had started, you know, before all of this happened, but it finally just got released. And something like that says, this is something that all employees have to look at. It's something they all have to consider and figure out how to develop goals relating to themselves, you know, their teams, the organization as a whole. So I think the more that we can do things like that, where we're incorporating these practices into everything, as opposed to having it kind of be viewed as a siloed thing that only some people participate in, I think that's really what's needed and has been needed for a long time.
This is a different moment, and we've been talking about inclusion and diversity for the better part of, you know, 15, 20 years in corporate America, sort of fully in a full way, or in a way that we thought was a full way. But this is the first time that we, as corporations, are actually being forced to confront our sort of failures, our demons, our lack of progress, and, you know, and it's almost kind of like the lip service part of what D&I work, you know, has been, is no longer acceptable. And the difference is that, you know, for those of us who've been in this space and, you know, being practitioners of it, you know, we've been sort of pushing the rock up, you know, up the mountain. And what seems to be happening now is that we're not the only ones pushing that rock up, and it's becoming now others' roles to do so and to be very vocal and visible about it. And so for those organizations who have been sort of doing this work, it's going to be less of a lift. We have been having conversations around racism. We started a series almost 2 years ago. And, you know, we were bringing, you know, this was led by our Black Professionals Network, Black professionals group, and having these roundtable discussions, conversations with allies, with other members of the State Street community. So that had been happening already. Now, had it been happening at scale? No. Was every sort of senior executive required to sort of be part of these discussions or expected to? No. Some of them did and some of them didn't. Now the expectations are different. And I think that, and what I think is changing drastically and dramatically is the public way in which companies are being required, exposed, when you look at everything that's happening from, PepsiCo deciding to, change and pull the Aunt Jemima, sort of product, and all these different organizations all of a sudden are realizing that they're either the product, the brand, or has connotations or remnants of, slavery and other parts of our ugly history. I think that most companies are coming to a realization that we need to do something drastically different, and it has to be more action-oriented than just basically putting out a statement saying that, hey, we stack lives, right? So I think that.
Just to add to that as well, I truly believe, our role as D&I practitioners is to continue showing the support to our Black and Brown colleagues. And that's pretty much by expanding and accelerating, our efforts in the D&I space. Our leadership team that we have at Wellington is working closely with, we have a D&I committee. I mentioned the Shades Network, and that's mainly to identify actions. We want to take these actions. How can we help make a difference in these areas? And when we think about it, we think about leadership and accountability, right? By taking more of a hands-on approach to improve diversity and inclusion at the firm. And this will also include, focus on hiring, developing, and promoting Black and underrepresented talent into investment management and leadership roles. Becoming better educated, we talked about that, right? By expanding diversity inclusion trainings for all of our managers and leaders and making it more holistic instead of just narrowing it down. Develop our Black and diverse talent, and that's more by investing in more skill-based training, right, for these early career Black and diverse professionals. And we have this new program launching, it's called Groundbreakers, and it's a program for our underrepresented talent to pretty much help them climb the ladder, and almost like lift as you climb. And it's a program too that we're offering managers to be a part of that, so they are in the know of what your underrepresented talent is learning and challenges that they may be facing as well. And lastly is to make a bigger difference in our communities. And that's mainly to identify opportunities to become more active, more visible, and involved with different community organizations, community leaders, and being more kind of in the space, right? Being in the space of helping our communities. We have what's called a Wellington Management Foundation program, which we've donated massive money in the programs that, that are in the space that we can help make a difference. And we're also, involving our employees to, whether it's donating individually, and we help contribute with that as well. So it's a lot of push that we're doing on our end to try to make a difference in the space as well.
Thank you, Anna. Jen, is RTI doing anything to leverage this moment in time? Or do you think they should be doing something, this kind of unique space we're in?
Well, we absolutely are. And, I had alluded to it earlier that, there are certain things that we had ongoing that, to Paul's point, is kind of like we're not pushing the rock up the hill as much, at least on our own. So we had certain offerings where it was like, well, we can offer this many trainings, this many times a year, and that was kind of all the budget would support. And now there's a realization, like anyone who wants to be trained in this stuff needs to have the opportunity. And so one of the things we're doing more of, I mentioned some of the internal trainings that we do, but we've also gone to some external experts to facilitate different types of, discussions or presentations. And one of those, there's an organization called the Racial Equity Institute, and they do what's called a groundwater training. I see you nodding, Joyya. So it's basically about how we tend to look at racial injustice and inequity in these sort of siloed systems, but really racism is in the groundwater, like if each of those systems is a lake. But it's very educational, and I think sometimes, there are settings where it's helpful to have discussions and trainings facilitated by internal folks, and also sometimes where it's better to bring in external experts, either because they have different capabilities, or also sometimes because you know, it's easier in some ways, I think, to have someone who's not your everyday colleague trying to kind of communicate that to you, and to reduce burden, you know, on our staff who are being asked to deliver all these kinds of things. So I think it's taking a good look at what we can provide ourselves, and then bringing in experts, especially at this time when there's so much demand for learning, to kind of fill those gaps and help employees learn.
We have questions building up from our participants. I'd like to ask one more question before we start to take questions from the folks out there. I'm interested if you could, you know, in your organizations, you know, Paul, you mentioned lip service, and I think sometimes about D&I training as window dressing. We say it so that it appears we're doing the right thing, but it doesn't necessarily feel integrated into the core practices of what we do. I can't remember whether it was Ana or Jen that mentioned that, but I'm wondering what you think, what are the one or two things that you think are most important for really integrating this into our organization and not having it feel like a standalone thing? And Joyya, I feel like I didn't get around to you last time. Could you start with us what you think, you know, Suffolk could do to really integrate some of these messages and values and practices in the organization so that they're not just window dressing?
Well, for me, it starts with unconscious bias. Mm-hmm. And I think that perspective taking is probably key. We can have all types of programs and initiatives, but it starts with the head and the heart. And if people are not able to think about their own behaviors, their beliefs, and their ways of interacting with people from different groups, then we're window dressing. We're not able to make the change. So I would start with unconscious bias. When we think about our inclusive hiring practices, I would start there, making sure that teams are prepared to deal with their own unconscious or bias that shows up in the hiring process. And I think that's a good place to start. But then there's also the retention piece. I think there has to be an interconnectedness that really allows for people to connect and to sustain the organization. And in order to do that, again, it goes back to relationship building. It goes back to some of those things that are hard to really quantify, but there is a qualitative piece to it where we have to continue to engage, continue to have these conversations. I think we can't just leave it on the shelf after we've had a workshop. We have to integrate it and make sure that it's ongoing and it shows up in our curriculum, particularly with our students. We're calling on our students to be inclusive leaders when they leave Suffolk. So making sure that they have opportunities inside the classroom to engage with people who have different backgrounds, give them an opportunity to really confront and deal with their own unconscious bias. And I think we will do our very best in that effort to integrate it throughout. So those would be, to me, the major things. It's head and heart.
So educating people so that they're aware of their own biases, particularly those involved in hiring.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Other folks, what are, you know, one or two things you think are critical to prevent this from being window dressing?
Accountability. You have to be able to measure progress. You have to be able to hold people accountable. You have to be able to create a set of expectations that you're going to measure this work in the same way that you measure your business goals. And, you know, so you have a scorecard for your senior leaders that outlines what their business results are, but right there next to it is their human capital results, right? So from, you know, hiring processes to promotional decisions to comp decisions, et cetera, to make sure that it is all integrated. The other thing that's happening is, you know, sometimes people do cultural work that is separate from, you know, I&D, D&I, whatever you want to call it, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so you have to integrate that. You have to say that you have to sort of look at your cultural and corporate values, make sure that they have an inclusion diversity lens there. We are actually going through a sort of transformation, 18-month transformation process where we're looking at everything and coming up with what is the new social contract for if you're a State Street employee, if you're as an organization, what, you know, we having this whole sort of work stream around culture that, and so we have to be, tied at the hip in that work, because it can't be a separate, set of values for inclusion and diversity and a separate set of values for our cultural values, right? And so you have to do all that in an integrated way. And you have to have people own it, right? So we as practitioners shouldn't own, a progress around inclusion and diversity. That's owned by the business leaders in corporate. And our culture is owned and driven by our hiring managers, our leaders. So we are just subject matter experts, but the work and the execution of these programs and these strategies have to be tied to, the performance of our leaders, and that has to be measured.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul.
Just to add to that too, I love how you mentioned accountability, Paul, because I truly feel the same way. Here at Wellington, we also provide what's called diversity dashboards, and that's pretty much presented to each team or business line leader. So they're aware of their diversity stats as it relates to race, officership levels, and each leader owns those D&I goals. They create their own goals, their own mission for their specific team on how they can help improve their diversity stats. And we have, as a firm, have an obligation. We've committed to, increasing our diversity stats by 5% as well. So we have that on us to help push this initiative forward. And as I believe it was Joyya that mentioned in terms of recruiting, yes, strongly agree. We are currently working with our recruiters, and that's to help them build their strategy around diversity hiring, training our managers to think outside the box when it comes to hiring diverse talent. Because when we think about it, a lot of people like to use the word culture fit. They're not a culture fit to the organization. We try to, amplify it, that it's not just culture fit. You want to think of it as a culture add. So a lot of people have different things they can bring to an organization. They may not be that perfect fit, but they can add given their differences in backgrounds and experiences too. So we try to push that forward with that initiative with our hiring managers and also recruiters too.
Thank you, Anna. Jen, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, one thing I appreciate everything everyone just said. That culture fit is such a huge issue, I think, in so many organizations. So I think every business needs to get educated about that and move away from it, because, right, it means fitting people into the status quo, which tends to be white most of the time. And it's very problematic. One other thing I was going to add is, one of the things that we're considering, similar to, this accountability issue and kind of providing more measurable actions with regard to racial equity, we're looking at a couple of different ways that we can further integrate racial equity plans into our various existing business plans. So as a research organization, this is just one example. Every research project has what's called a quality management plan, and it's quality around your staffing, how data is, acquired and used, those kinds of things. And so one of the things that we're talking about is we should have a racial equity plan that's part of every project's quality management plan, because this is something that everyone has to develop for every single project, that has to be revisited to make sure that you're following everything that you've outlined in the plan. And so I think either doing that or hopefully more things like that than just that one example, but just exactly what everyone else is saying. Just, there's that saying that what gets measured gets managed. So it's like, how can we incorporate these things into what gets measured? Because that's what'll ensure that, after maybe this isn't as popular of a discussion topic, the issue is not going to go away. We need to make sure that we're still paying attention to it and still being accountable. So it's just one thing.
Thank you. So we have, I have questions coming in on chat, and Jodi Detjen is also taking questions. Jodi, you can hear me, right?
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions that are really talking about this idea of what's the role of business and organizations to address racism outside of the office. So one person's talking about, like thinking about it at a business dinner, industry conference. Another person's talking about looking at it at a sector-wide level, or even making systemic change beyond the organization. So I'd like to open up to the panelists. What do you think is the responsibility of organizations to look beyond the organization and making the wider systemic changes?
Corporations have, if you're a consumer or customer facing organization, you absolutely do have that duty. Otherwise, your product, your businesses and your business models may perish, right, in this new environment where, or may not be as profitable in this new environment where people are expecting you to be socially conscious and a responsible citizen and a good corporate citizen. So I think, and depending on, some companies have a bigger bully pulpit than others. And so there has to be a sense of what can we do, because this issue is not just within our corporations. This issue doesn't just live within individuals. This issue is, by the way, it's not just a U.S.-based issue, right? So we tend to think of it as a U.S.-based issue, and to be honest, I mean, the conversations that we're having right now are global conversations because racism exists everywhere, and so it just shows up in different forms. So I personally believe companies have a huge responsibility. State Street takes that very much to heart, and we're always sort of saying, what can we do to sort of raise awareness, to drive change, and to have an impact on the broader communities in which we live, work, and play. And that could again take on different meanings, and there are different ways in which you can do it. Statements are great, actions are better.
Anyone else?
One thing I'll add too, I know, in my particular field, we're in research, and a lot of the folks that we hire and who lead studies are folks who have their doctoral degrees. And, not just in my organization, but across the board, people say, well, it's hard to hire diversely because, there's a pipeline issue, and, not most of the people who have PhDs are white. And it's like, well, yes. And what do we do about that? Okay, so we need to strengthen our internship programs. We need to build better relationships with community members and high school students. And, if we build relationships with high school programs, then, in 10 years, those will be people with PhDs that will be ready to hire, So I think it's playing the long game and not just thinking about, well, it's not easy. I don't see the solution in front of me. So sorry, this is my excuse for why it can't be done, is thinking in terms of what other systems do we need to connect with to solve those problems.
Yeah, I agree with everyone's statements. I would just like to add in terms of just being a part of the community. I think being able to donate to NAACP, UNEF, UNCF, and just thinking about, these educational programs that we're helping to donate to, that we're helping with the education, because they're going to be our talent pipeline. So just being in the community and being able to donate and, being responsive to what's going on in the matter, definitely think that's important in these times.
Thank you. Jodi, I've got a question here. How important is corporate board representation, and how can businesses work towards more diverse boards? Does anyone on the panel want to address that question?
Hugely important. For a number of different reasons. You want diverse perspective that add different set of approaches, opinions, solutions, direction, governance to the organizations. I would say from a purely governance perspective, it's hugely important to have that diverse body of representation. So, companies need to do a better job of having board representation that is either reflective of the markets and the communities in which they operate, or the consumer base and customer base they serve. And if nothing else, again, so that you can have a different point of view, you can have challenge and debate that can then result in a better outcome. And that's just proven sort of D&I 101 business case, right? Which is to say different voices have a much better, provide you with a much better result. So it's hugely important, hugely visible, and it's an issue that, we need to continue to tackle head on. Organizations have not done a great job of having diverse representation on their boards, whether it's gender, whether it's any other demographic, but especially when it comes to Black and African American voices at those tables. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that includes my own company, by the way, which, the one Black director we had retired, Professor Linda Hill, retired from the board, I think close to 3 years ago. And, we still have that void in our board to sort of add a voice there. So, I'm not absolving State Street from that responsibility. I think that's one of the things that is different this time, that organizations need to be very transparent about what their shortcomings are and what are the action plans to sort of rectify those things.
Agreed. And just to add to that, we definitely need diverse perspective at all levels, senior levels the most, right? And if especially the boards, when we look at the boards, if they're not asking the questions, then almost the C-suite really isn't answering in that sense. So having those diverse perspective, being intentional in every level to help challenge the prototype and image of what good leadership looks like.
Tammy, there's another question I'd like to throw to the panel. That's just a couple different people are bringing this up, and this idea of how do you respond? So it's shifting slightly off the organizational piece and looking at it from a personal perspective. How does a person of color respond to a white colleague who's now just waking up to what's happening? Like, where have they been? And then someone else asked this whole idea of how do you also address the phenomenon of being the only Black person in the room? So I'm wondering if people on the panel could respond to that. Thank you.
Anna, you want to go?
Sure. I would first congratulate the white colleague for being woke in this atmosphere, and just, help them along the way. Help them along the way. If they're asking questions, let them know that it's a safe place. It's always a safe place to ask any questions. And I know with anyone, and just from me talking to my white peers as well, they're afraid. They're afraid to say the wrong thing. If someone is Black, mentioning to them that they're African-American, maybe they don't like to be called African-American. So just making it feel like it's okay for them to ask those questions and be in a safe space, I think will help with that piece as well.
Paul, you look tired by that question.
No. Actually, in the last 3 weeks, I've actually talked to more white people than I've talked to Black people. And that's a good thing. And it's because, again, people are seeking guidance. People are reaching out, trying to be allies. And, part of it is, welcome to the fight, right? Welcome to, and it's going to feel uncomfortable. You have never, most folks that, perhaps happen to be white, perhaps haven't on a daily basis have to deal with race or think about race, where we do, whether we want to or not. And so this is something that, they're sort of awakening to and figuring out that they actually not only do one thing is to say, well, I'm not racist. I love everyone, and the typical, oh, I have Black friends, or the typical, I don't see color, which is very offensive to Black people. And we can get into why that is. But I just think that, we should welcome them to the fight. We want them to be allies. We're not going to be able to solve this, just us. And I think that we need to end this, enough division as it is in society nowadays. And so we need to do that. I do think that there is a little bit of that sort of, some of us might still be dealing with this emotional piece that we may not have enough energy to sort of carry our white colleagues in our backs right now in order to make them feel good about what they need to do. And that's what I was referencing earlier, that, there's a little bit of that, I need to figure it out myself. But certainly, I think that if you are Black and you happen to be approached by a white person saying, I want to help, absolutely, with open arms. And, conversely, if you're white and you're sort of thinking, what do I do? What can I say? Take that first step. And then, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at the type of conversations that you're going to engage with, and that will be really hugely beneficial to you as a person as well.
One little thing I wanted to add, kind of on the flip side of that, I saw some comments in the chat box about authenticity too. One of the things that I've heard recently that's been helpful, like for me personally, and just to keep in mind and sharing with other white people, is kind of like, especially if you're thinking about reaching out to Black colleagues or colleagues of color right now, if you wouldn't normally, like, ask yourself, why am I doing this? Like, is it because it has to do with your own feelings? And like, I want to show, like, I want to make sure that, you know, that I'm anti-racist or I'm not racist. And like, is it something about alleviating your own guilt and feelings? Because if it is, you probably want to pause and reconsider if you want to take the person's time with that, as opposed to if it's something that's more solutions focused and, you know, really genuinely interested in making a change. So I think from our part, that's one thing to just kind of ask yourself, like, what is my motivation behind whatever this interaction is? But I appreciate the perspective of encouraging people to not feel afraid of making mistakes, because it's true that we all make mistakes and we all need to, yeah, work on this issue together. So I appreciate those perspectives.
We have about 5 minutes left. And so I think that I would like to ask now if I don't know, if you all have, you know, a final parting shot, comment, word of wisdom that you'd like to offer briefly, and then Jodi Detjen is going to come back on and talk us out. Any final comments, Anna?
I will keep it short. I would like to say, be bold, be inclusive, be intentional, and be courageous, because definitely now is the time to act, and there shouldn't be any more silence around this.
Nice, thank you. Action oriented, I like it. Joyya?
I have 3 words. I'm like you, Anna, very quick and to the point. I'm asking people to reflect, rethink, and respond. Those are 3 easy things you can do. Reflect, rethink, and respond.
And Juneteenth is the day for that, for sure, right? Jen?
So much I want to say, but I will just say, especially for all of us white folks out there, stop being silent when you hear things that are wrong and stand up for things. If it's, you know, your relative that says something that's slightly off color, or, you know, especially if it's somebody in the workplace, like, not saying something is taking an action in the wrong direction. So we have to stop being silent when we hear things that need to stop.
Since we're in the 3-word themes, I will say be curious. So educate yourself, learn, understand the issues. I would say be action-oriented. So figure out what you can do in your own sphere of influence, whether it's within your family, your community, your neighborhood, your organization, individually. What can you do? And lastly, be humble. You're going to be going through some sort of transformation where you are going to realize that what the lens that you have been using up until now probably had a little bit of blind spots, or a little bit of, you know, different, I guess, prism to it. So you just need to be humble and understand that you may have to rethink the way that you have been socialized.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you to all of you. Jodi, there you are.
Yeah, just as a final parting word, thank you all. Thank you to the panelists for being here and your insightful wisdom. Thank you to all the attendees. I think what we've heard is that we are in a unique moment, and we have an opportunity. And it's on each one of us to not only work on ourselves individually, but also work with our organizations to make change, and then to make societal change. And what I think you heard from all 4 panelists is that this is about the time to be courageous, to rethink, to be curious, and then to act. So on that note, I want to say I am committing to act in relation to the Suffolk MBA program. We've been doing a lot of work around inclusiveness. We're going to see what else we can do to actually bring this more into our curriculum. So I'm committing to that right here. And I want to thank, and I'm hoping that everybody in the community just take 1 action today and then 1 action tomorrow and keep on going. And we will wake up in a year to a different world. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful Juneteenth. Please honor the day.